What is moralized, racialized epistemology, and what does it have to do with critical race theory? Well, that's what I want to talk about. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. So what I want to do in this video is I want to dig a little bit into some kind of philosophical ideas that I see at least as operating under the surface of a lot of the controversy and the tension around the critical race theory topic today. And again, I've said this in previous videos in this series, but I'm really starting to lean more into commenting on what I call popular prescriptive critical race theory. So simply because that term, the critical race theory, that term more and more is just referring to that popular edge, that applied kind of edge. And it just has more traction in our culture right now and has more influence. Frankly, just more people have read Robin DiAngelo than have read Mari Matsuda. More people have read, Ibram X. Kendi than have read Derek Bell. And so it's I'm more and more talking about that kind of popular edge. I know that frustrates some people who really want to defend the more academic side, but kind of that just is such as it is, at least for now. But I think it is important to continue to respond to it because of the sheer amount of influence that some of these writers have, and that have been influenced by that what was originally a deeply academic, legal area of scholarship. If you don't know the history there, I'd encourage you to watch videos 1 and 2 maybe of this series in which I try to give some context for it. But what I want to do today is I want to get under the surface a little bit more. I want to get into these terms that I'm talking about, moralized, racialized epistemology, and hopefully try to illuminate at least what I see as contributing to some of the tensions and some of the stalemates that we run into in our conversations about this topic today. So what I want to do to that end, I want to name what I see as kind of 3 different factors, intellectual movements, intellectual ideas that kind of combine and build up into what I'm calling moralized, racialized epistemology. And I'll just comment briefly on each and kind of comment on how they come together, and then end with some more discussion and critique, I guess, things to consider as we tackle this conversation that's really, really pressing and important. So the first one, the first kind of bedrock idea, is the idea of moral or philosophical relativism, right? I'm not the first person to talk about this, and I'm not using the term relativism loosely. Some people like to throw that around as kind of a boogeyman. I'm not doing that. I mean it really in the true sense, in that with moral and philosophical relativism, that commitment, that idea is that our morals, our moral frameworks, and philosophically, like our knowledge and what we consider wise and what we know, those things, so relativism would have it, those things are truly relative. They're relative to your viewpoint, they're relative to your experiences in the world. What is moral to you is only moral to you by virtue of what you've experienced and who you are, your identities. And that is not, you cannot then, and the idea goes, you cannot then assume and project that onto anyone else that might have very different experiences than you. That's a moral, philosophical relativism. That's really, really a really, really baseline kind of foundational, in my mind, factor that contributes to what I'm ultimately going to be talking about as it relates to CRT. And it must be said that this relativism, at least a part of this relativism has arisen. I'm speaking in a lot of generalities here. I always shudder a little bit to speak so generally, but it's fair to say, I think, that this kind of relativism does arise in part as a reaction to the overreach of certainty in modernity, right? So the modernist claim that's bound up in, it must be said, things like colonialism and science, of course, and a lot of real historical racism. This modernist idea that we can actually stand on our own 2 feet and with certainty claim that we know what is true, that's bound up in that modernity age, and this relativism, this reassertion of a relativism, I think is fair to say is in part a reaction to that certainty in modernity. So, but nevertheless, that's where we're wrestling with kind of the tension between those 2 things today, and relativism is really strong. How dare you claim any certainty in things like a moral framework, right? So, moral and philosophical relativism is operative here. A second one, building on top of that, is related, but is this idea of awareness of one's social location. I've commented on this in other videos, so I won't spend a lot of time on this. I have a whole video on standpoint epistemology, which is really, really, really big in this whole social location idea. But the idea that your building off of relativism, the idea that your social location then is determinative to your sense of morals, your sense of what is true, your philosophy, your framework, all of that stuff. Your social location, where you were born into the world, namely for me as a male, as white, my gender, all that stuff, is determinative. This is what the social location kind of idea is. It's determinative for how you then claim about what's true, what one can know, what one believes. Your location in the world is important for that. That's a lot about standpoint epistemology comes out of that. An analogy here I find is helpful. So again, this is building on top of, so there's relativism underneath that, social location on top of that as a determinative factor in what you determine is relative. So an analogy I find helpful here comes from Coleman Hughes. If you're familiar with him, his podcast, his work, he's someone that I follow. I appreciate the way that he unpacks a lot of ideas. And he's used this analogy that I found helpful, and I'm going to credit to him in terms of social location. But he uses the analogy of accents, spoken accents, and that when someone grows up in a certain culture, they perceive themselves as not having an accent because that's just, quote, what people sound like. I definitely had this experience. I remember the first time I met someone who was British when I was a kid, and asked him about my accent. It was just such a fascinating experience to think that like he thought I had an accent, was he didn't think he had one. That whole idea of you don't perceive yourself as having an accent because what you experience is neutral, whereas everyone else has accents. That's kind of an analogy for kind of this standpoint social location idea, is that you see yourself as neutral, right? Because you are all that you've experienced, and that is determined by your social location, where you enter the world, right? Kind of like the accents. The accents is kind of a benign example of that, largely benign example of that in our culture. But that is on top of relativism. That's making an additional kind of assertion that your social location is actually constrains what you believe. And so number 3, so relativism and then social location on top of relativism. And then the third one that I want to comment on here is, and this is where it gets into actual critical race theory specifically, the third one is then the permanence and the impact of racism in American culture, right? And so the permanence of racism is the subtitle of Derek Bell's well-known book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well. And so the assertion there is that racism is powerfully operative in American culture, and it can be invisible, but it's indelible. Like you cannot avoid it. You cannot extricate yourself from it because it permeates top to bottom so much of our society, our culture, our structures, all of that, right? So take these things together. There's a relativism, and then the assertion of social location being determinative, and then on top of that, the sirens in the background here. On top of that, the notion that racism is indelible, top to bottom, foundational in American society, right? I'm going to repeat that because of the siren. Racism is a powerful factor in our society. So fit these things all together, and again, I talked about how the reason that assertion of racism being so powerful asserted itself in the critical race theory movement in the 80s and 90s was because of a disillusionment with civil rights, because civil rights didn't solve inequalities in our society, and so racism, as the argument goes, must be deeply embedded, must be invisible, because our dismantling laws can't solve it, so it must be more permanent in that sense. So I know I'm speaking fast, I'm trying to work through these concepts, but take these things together. If things are relative, if our social location is that important, and if racism is such a vital factor in American society, then someone whose social location is white in that society in which racism is so determinative and so important, the white person will be constrained by their social location, and their social location will be determined by racist impacts, by racist laws, racist history, racist structures. So this racism determines your social location, and then your social location determines how you perceive the world, and that's all relative, right? And so therefore, what kind of emerges out of that is what I'm calling, I'll start here with saying it's at least a racialized epistemology, right? A racialized epistemology. So what that means, epistemology is just how do you know what you know? Well, in this argument, this way of constructing kind of how our society functions and how it impacts and shapes people, a racialized epistemology says everything that you know and can know is determined by your race, and is determined by racism then. Your social location, right, is infected top to bottom by racism. That's a racialized epistemology. So it's an assertion that kind of every way that you see the world, every way you take in information, every way you make decisions, every way you interpret things is inflected by race and racism. That's the argument that emerges out of the combination of all these factors, I think. And now, so the idea then is that you cannot extricate yourself out of being impacted by racial groups, racialization, and racism historically, legally, and all of that. Now, you notice I'm calling it moralized, racialized epistemology. Well, if you take this racialized epistemology idea, there's another layer that gets added onto it that does emerge out of this popular critical race theory critique of society. Namely, that is this whole idea, and if you've watched the previous videos in the series so far, this is an argument I've been kind of trying to unpack. The argument that race was man-made and constructed hierarchically, and whiteness was put at the top, and as we're reckoning with the injustice of that historically, the argument of kind of popular critical race theory is that whiteness then is inherently immoral and monstrous and unjust. The idea of whiteness, the idea of constructing a racial group and putting that group at the top hierarchically. Now combine that with this epistemological framework of relativism and social location and all that, and then what starts to emerge out of this combination of all of these factors, I think, is a moralized inflection on top of a racialized inflection of epistemology. That is to say, and this is what I've started to reckon with and wrestle with and bump up against, that is to say, if one is white, if one occupies a white social location, and if whiteness is itself a fundamentally unjust, immoral, problematic construction, and if one's social location determines relativistically all that one can know and say and understand about the world, then to be white in our culture is to occupy an inherently, intrinsically, top-to-bottom problematic location. And it's moralized in that sense. And I don't think it's too far to say, at least, again, this in its popular applications and interpretations, I don't think it's too far to say is that sometimes just being white is evil. It's moralized in that sense. That's the moralized, racialized epistemology that's starting to emerge, I think, from the combination of all of these philosophical ideas that get built and put together in a certain way to kind of interpret the world, right? And so then the injustices that have been attached to the very creation of and the perpetuation of whiteness, which historically, I've tried to go at great pains to say, I think that the work of critical race theorists historically and descriptively has been so helpful, and there are a lot of historical injustices attached to the idea of creating whiteness and who can be included in that and all of that. I've done videos on that, so I'm not going to belabor that point now. I have a lot of sympathy and have found a lot of help in a lot of that scholarship. Nevertheless, when these philosophical ideas start to emerge, especially in that prescriptive, popularized sense, what we start to see emerge is a really inherent problematizing claim that to be white is to occupy and to take on an epistemological framework that is immoral and unjust. And so what happens then as a white person emerging into that kind of matrix is to start to internalize this idea, and this is the previous video I got into some of these internalizations of this, is to internalize this idea that I can't trust anything I know because my very way of taking in everything in the world is evil because it's white, and I can't escape that. So in the previous video I talked about some classically Christian ideas of original sin that I think can actually lend some helpful language to some of these concepts. Nevertheless, that was the previous video. You can watch that if that's of interest to you. What I'm trying to identify here is some of the popular philosophy that fuels this. So where I want to go with this, if I have my finger on something here, and this is, I think that this is part of what's bubbling to the surface and what's feeding a lot of resentment when it comes to white people who are coming up against this and essentially feeling trapped by this way of framing the way that we can take in the world and understand the world. I think it's feeding a lot of resentment. It's feeding a lot of backlash that's happening because of the rigid way of formulating this and then inserting people into a defined, problematized, very, very ontology. It actually gets ontological because it's commenting on someone's being and their very nature as a white person is evil. Is kind of the way it's starting to emerge in certain settings. I know I can already hear pushback. I know that there are more thoughtful critical race theorists and anti-racist activists who would not agree with this way of framing it. I know that there are those, and I know there are more thoughtful, more nuanced voices. Nevertheless, this is something that is gaining traction in a lot of anti-racist kind of dialogue and activism. So what I want to end on here is, if I have my finger on something here, I want to end on just kind of two responses, two questions, two critiques, two ways to kind of get at this framework in a different way that I think may nuance it or expand it a bit and kind of interrogate it a little bit. And so the first, they're kind of questions / considerations, things to think about. The first one is this: I want to challenge the idea of race being the kind of superseding factor, standpoint, group identity. Race is the one lens, it seems, in the critical race theory kind of work. Again, race is the second word in CRT, right? So it kind of makes sense that it would be important. But race has superseded other standpoints that could also influence our epistemology, in the popular CRT sense. By this I mean, there are lots of other experiences in the world, identity markers even, you could say, that influence one's epistemology. Some obvious ones are class. Economic class is a huge one in American society. I mean, we are in a very economically stratified society right now. Inequality is huge. And so how does class fit into that? This is a common pushback you get, I think, in this conversation. But there's a lot of others. Another example I always use that never gets any attention in my mind is athleticism, or just attractiveness, or even personal charisma, personal likability. I mean, these are things that impact the way one experiences the world and possibly impact one's epistemology, like how one constructs one's knowledge and takes in knowledge in the world can be very much influenced by one's level of attractiveness in our society. Attractiveness as defined in a certain way, right? Which is a cultural value that has changed and morphed over different cultures and different times, different centuries. But there's a ton of other variables and factors that can influence one's epistemology beyond just one's race and racial grouping. And ironically, this is where the concept of intersectionality can actually be helpful to open up other dialogues and other viewpoints as to see, well, how does one's race has a certain impact, but how do all these other vectors impact how one takes in the world? And so one caution is to kind of it's almost as if popularized critical race theory has put race at the top of its own hierarchy of identities, right? And so race is kind of the most important determinative one for how one constructs epistemology and can even know. It feels so utterly determined by race, and nothing else can affect that or be on equal footing. So that's consideration number one. Consideration number two is that I think, and I want to word this really carefully because this can be a lazy critique, and I don't mean it as such, but this moralized, racialized epistemology, insofar as it really is truly relativistic, it gets tripped up in the same place that all truly relativistic claims stumble, right? And that is, it's a totalizing claim about everything being relative, right? Again, this is a lazy response, a lazy critique that can be thrown around just to shut down conversation, and that's not how I'm employing it, but I do think it is really at the foundation of a lot of this. Insofar as relativism is operating here, to press relativism to its conclusion starts to collapse on itself because it's a totalizing claim that everything is relative. You can't make a totalizing claim and say that everything is relative, because that in itself, it honestly just cancels itself out logically. So that's something that I think needs to come back to the table, is this combination of, if race has been put at the top of its own hierarchy as being so determinative of everything we know and experience, but then also if it rests on this really shaky philosophical foundation of a deep, deep, deep relativism, I think that's part of why we're starting to see a lot of collapses in kind of shared language and shared understanding and ability to have charitable dialogue, is because these things they honestly can't hold up to really intense scrutiny rather. And so it starts to collapse on itself, and it starts to cause ever increasing, I think, vitriol and reasserting instead of arguing. Instead of dialogue, it's just assertion. And I've talked about this in other videos too, but this video is hopefully helpful in unpacking some deeper philosophical concepts, and hopefully a short enough, concise enough fashion. But moralized, racialized epistemology is operating really in full force, and it's determining a lot of how we can talk. because it's making claims about the morality of people's very being and people's very way of experiencing the world. And there are some deeply troubling aspects to it. So part of what I want to do here is, again, pull out the things that I find troubling so as to recover the things that are helpful. And there are indeed helpful things that I've covered in other videos. So I think where I want to go next with this, or get into some ways about how CRT encourages us to frame history, particularly of America. I want to talk about structures and culture, concepts like that, and potentially other questions as they come up. So if you have questions that this sparks for you, if there's things that deserve further clarity and more unpacking, post below. Let me know what you think. Let me know what your responses to these concepts are. If you've encountered this kind of moralized, racialized epistemology in your own dialogues and interactions with people, I'd love to know that. And I'd love to know how that looks for you. But as always, thank you for watching, and I hope that you found this thought-provoking in your own life. Thanks.